So there was a question about Kamala Harris and asking if it's a good thing that she was selected to be the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic nomination. I don't know. I don't have any idea. I'm not a political expert. And as a religious community, we don't endorse any particular party or candidate. But we do believe in the power of conscience, the power of our democratic process. That is our fifth principle. It's actually one of our 7 principles, is allowing everyone to have a voice and a vote. That's how we talk about it with our children. So I think it's powerful that a woman of color, a child of immigrants, was nominated for such an important political position. But I don't pretend to speak about the political ramifications of that. We can hope it's a good thing. And then my second question that is related to that one a little bit was a question about what is my favorite of the 7 principles? And the person who asked the question noted that that might change for me from time to time, and that is true. But I would say the one that Kim talked about during the Wonder Box is sort of persistently my favorite. It's our 4th principle, which says that we believe in we uphold the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And I've talked about this in sermons before, but if you think about our 7 principles and you stack them up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like an arch. Number 1 and number 7, the inherent worth and dignity and the interdependent web of all existence, are the pillars that the arch stands on. And most of us, if you've been around Unitarian Universalism for any length of time, you know those 2. Those are really important. The 4th one is the keystone. It's the middle that holds the arch up. And I really believe that our 4th principle is what makes us Unitarian Universalists, that it is part of our religious path to ask questions, to be on a search for truth and meaning, to recognize that nobody is going to hand us those answers. And I think that's really unique to our tradition. We're not the only tradition that values questions, but I think it's really fundamental to who we are. It's not just that we don't know the answers to things, but we start from a stance of wondering, not of certainty. And that's really, in some ways, really beautiful, and in some ways, really hard. But I would say number 4 is my favorite principle. So I'm going to let Steve play for another 30 seconds, and then I'll sift through to answer another question. All right, so there were a couple questions about afterlife. What happens when people die? Do we believe in an afterlife? And then are there any beliefs that we might hold about pre-life? What happens before we are born? So I'm going to combine all of these. And true to our 4th principle, we don't hold a common agreement about what happens before we're born or after we die. We are each free to discern for ourselves what we believe happens before and after this life on this earth. And again, I don't know. I've not had any deep insight into what happens. I've had my own personal experiences that give me my own ideas, but I think what I know for sure is that when our bodies die, that we're no longer conscious on this earth. And so our one of the questions was actually asked by a child, and so I want to answer this in a way that's understandable for a child. When the body dies, the thing that makes us, that makes our personality, the things that give us our thoughts and our feelings and our ideas, goes away, and the body is sort of left, but the person is no longer in that body. And so often people will choose to cremate the body, which is actually burning the body in a fire to let ashes remain. It makes the body much smaller. And sometimes those ashes are scattered in a beautiful place so that we can remember that person in that beautiful place. Or sometimes the body is buried in the ground. But remember that when the body is buried or burned, that the person is not in there anymore. And so it doesn't hurt. They don't feel it. They don't know what's going on because the thing that makes them them is gone. Now, where it went, we don't totally know. Some people think that it goes to a place, that it goes to heaven, or that it goes to be with other souls, that thing that makes us us. Some people call that the soul or the spirit. Some people think that it gets reborn, that thing gets put back into a new body, maybe an animal's body or a new person's body. And some people say they remember when they were in other bodies from before they were born in this life. So these are all different ideas. I don't really know. And you know what? I personally, my own concern about what happens after we die is I don't have a lot of concern about it. I think the most important thing is that we know for sure we have this life and that we will use it the best we can. And I'm not overly concerned with trying to make my life last forever and ever and ever, because I know it's going to last, I hope, 80 years, maybe more. And the thing that's so beautiful about not having our lives last forever, it means that each day we have is very valuable. It means that it gives each day extra meaning. If it lasted forever and ever and ever, it wouldn't have as much meaning. And so I just try really hard to recognize that this life is a gift and that we can use it to make the world better, to be kind to people, and whatever happens next, happens next. I'm not going to gamble this life on the possibility of something else. Some people spend their whole lives working really hard for whatever it is that comes next. And I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to spend this life focused on that life, because I'm not even sure about that life, but I am sure about this one. And so that would be my answer to those questions about what happens on either side of this life. Steve? Hi, everybody. Oh my goodness, there's so many good questions. Okay, let's see which one's next. I'm gonna There's a question, there's sort of two questions. One is about how do we uphold our 7 principles when when there's so much hate and negativity in the world, particularly right now. How do we stay true to our 7 principles when that's happening? And then there's another question, actually a few questions, about how do we uphold our first principle? How do we hold that our first principle is true, that the inherent worth and dignity of every person, when some people are acting really irresponsibly, particularly around the pandemic. Some people are feeling very upset that they're seeing that other people are not behaving in ways that would make this pandemic shorter by, for example, wearing masks or socially distancing. So these are some of the questions that were posed. And my best response is that our 7 principles are aspirations. They're the goal. So they're the thing that binds us together as a community so that we can look together to them as our goal. It does not mean that we always manage to believe them. It doesn't mean that we don't struggle with them sometimes, but they're the goal. And often we fall short of goals, but the nature of a covenant is that it's a relational commitment. And I keep doing this with my hands because we as a community have agreed to be in relationship with each other by using these as our highest aspirations. So we'll come back together through them. We will come back to them each, anytime we say, man, I'm really falling short of that aspiration, and we'll help each other come back to that aspiration, to that principle. And so I think it's just really important to remember that human beings are human. We're flawed. We are not perfect. We mess up. And we are basically animals with the capacity for thought and animals with the capacity for problem solving. But we're not God. We're just trying our best. And in this kind of situation where we're 5-6 months into a worldwide pandemic where people are dying in the hundreds of thousands, there's going to be a lot of stress. Our whole world has turned upside down. This is a very, very stressful time. And I hear people constantly trying to sort of call themselves back to the good parts about this and the beautiful things about it. And that's really important, but it's also really important just to remember that this is a lot. This is hard and it's stressful, and people are not on their best behavior when they're under stress. Our whole world is under stress, and particularly our country is under a lot of stress. We're getting lots of mixed messages from all different places, and we're all having to do our best to make decisions. I recently read an article that talked about how human brains are not great at figuring out numbers and probabilities. And so when we're told, if you wear a mask in this situation, you have a 42% chance of contracting a virus, and then once you contract the virus, you have this percent chance of getting hospitalized or dying, our brains can't compute that. And we're getting that kind of information all the time. And so some people are opting to be very, very, very careful in the face of that. And some people are saying, I just can't handle this, I can't compute it, and I'm going to just go ahead and with my life. And it's very frustrating because these are two very different sides of a coin. But for me, it's just really, really helpful to not create villains in this scenario, to not say those people who are doing something different from me are evil. They're making choices that are different from mine. I wish they would make different choices. It frustrates me that they're making different choices, but they're not evil. They're not monsters. And that's what our first principle says. It says people have inherent worth and dignity. That means that no matter what they do, they have value as humans, that nothing we can do can take away that value. Now, that does not mean that every choice or every behavior has value. So we can disagree vehemently with the way people are handling this pandemic, but let's try not to make them into monsters. because they're not monsters. They're just people stressed out like the rest of us, trying to do their best. And the hate and negativity, I think, is a piece of that as well. People, when they're stressed, get snippy, get nasty, get aggressive. And this pandemic has just made all of the things that are already hard in our world, particularly justice issues, racial justice, access to healthcare, poverty, our society that makes housing inequality the vast inequalities in our country, it's just making them worse. And so people are mad. They're getting mad. And when people are mad, they're not always kind and nice. But I just try really hard to honor that is, if not my favorite reaction to stress, it's a normal one. And just to honor it in myself too, when I'm feeling snippy or angry, just to try to be compassionate with myself. So our 7 principles call us to compassion, not necessarily understanding. We don't have to understand it or like it or agree with it, but to have some compassion. I hope that helps. So, Steve? So there's a couple questions that are going to be easy for me to answer. So I'm going to try to answer those and then maybe save one of the harder ones for toward the end. One of the questions is, what books are you currently reading? So I always am reading something for that kind of for learning, something nonfiction, and then I'm always reading a fiction just for fun. Right now I'm alternating between the Neil Gaiman Discworld series, and right now I'm reading the Witches series, and I'm on the book The Weird Sisters, which is spelled W-Y-R-D, and it's really interesting about some witches. And Neil Gaiman's Discworld series is sort of fantasy, and it's really funny, really funny. So I'm enjoying that. And I'm also reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And I'm finding it really powerful. It's upending a lot of my understandings of racism and anti-racism. And I highly recommend this book, but I don't recommend it if you are new to learning about anti-racism. I don't read one of them. And the reason is, oops, I'm sorry. Somebody suggested that I had the wrong author for The Weird Sisters, and they're right. It's Terry Pratchett, not Neil Gaiman. I apologize. Terry Pratchett is the Discworld author, and Terry Pratchett is hilarious. So back to Ibram X. Kendi and How to Be an Anti-Racist. Yeah, if you're brand new to this learning and this work, I don't recommend this book. I've seen some folks just out in the world and online misuse and misquote Kendi because they don't have a lot of foundational understanding of anti-racism. And so, but if you've read some other things and you're not brand new to learning about anti-racism, then How to Be an Anti-Racist is a really nuanced and powerful book. So, yeah, and we're going to be doing some book reads and some activities this year here at the fellowship online. So I encourage you to join in those ways to learn about anti-racism. Another question that someone had was, when we return to in-person service, will we continue Zoom service? And the answer is yes, probably. I'm not sure if it will take place on Zoom or if it will take place on another platform, but once we have gotten the hang of this online way of worshiping, we will absolutely probably keep it going, even once it's happening from our sanctuary when people are together, because people will always have Sundays that they can't come in, or they're sick, or they're traveling, and this has sort of forced us into a new technology that's going to expand our reach. So yes, I hope that that is true. Another question was, do I have a UU elevator speech, or do I have tips for the UU elevator speech? And how do we answer the question of whether we are a cult? So for me, it's important to know who I'm talking to when I start giving my UU elevator speech. So if somebody says, "What's UU?" I have to kind of know who my audience is. And I often will explain that historically, Unitarianism and Universalism were both Christian denominations, that Universalism didn't believe in hell, they believed in a loving God, and that Unitarianism didn't believe that Jesus was God, but that Jesus was a man and a teacher. But that in the 60s, they came together and they no longer remained explicitly Christian anymore, but they kept this idea of love and looking to wise teachers, and that now we are guided by 7 principles that kind of hold us together in our relationships with each other, and that we work together to try to make the world a better place and help each other on our spiritual journey. So that's kind of my UU speech. I start with like a teeny tiny bit of history, and if that history is not relevant to the conversation, a lot of times people will ask me that question when they themselves are Christian and they're wanting to understand this faith. So sometimes that little bit of history helps kind of set the stage. If this person is vehemently anti-religious, maybe I won't start with that history so that they can hear me a little better. And then I end usually with that we help each other on this spiritual journey, that we don't all have the same answers, and that we try to make our world a better place. We focus more on this world and this life. That's kind of what I said in my afterlife answer, right? So if people ask if we're a cult, and that is often a question, somebody typed into the chat box about the cult question, because it's true. The definition of a cult is that people's autonomy of thought and autonomy of action is removed, that their choices are taken away. If you leave the cult, you will be shunned, you will lose your family, you will lose your resources, or there's a lot of fear embedded in cultism that takes away people's choices, that they feel stuck or trapped. Our 4th principle says we are each free to our own choices and our own path. So sort of the opposite of a cult. Like, we have so much more freedom of choice. And I often sort of joke that, if a cult leader says, we're all going to do this, then everyone says, okay, we'll do that. As a Unitarian Universalist minister, I can't do that. We have freedom on both sides of this pulpit. I can say, everybody's going to do this, and you guys can all say, no. And that's fine. That's how it works. So yeah, we're definitely not a cult. The problem is there have been some cults that sound like our name. The Church of the Unification Church, the Moonies, Unification sounds a lot like Unitarian Universalist. So it, that sometimes gets caught together. We also, I can't remember, I think it was Pat Robertson or some evangelical Christian preacher who has a big following, named a bunch of cults and named Unitarian Universalism as one. And his definition of cult was that we don't follow sort of a fundamentalist Christian view of who Jesus was. So I guess it depends on how you define cult, but no, we're not one. So we'll take another moment for music and then maybe another couple questions. So there were a couple questions about the current climate around anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, looting, violence, things like that. And these are really tricky questions. And again, the answer that I will have is my answer for the moment, for today, and it might be different from yours. So I go back to Dr. Martin Luther King's statement that riots are the voice of the oppressed. And I'm forgetting at the moment who said it also, but it was a quote that was talking about how when we look at looters, or we look at the people who are taking property or destroying property, we often focus on that, and we don't focus on the larger question of the generational trauma and generational harm that has been done to those people. The property, money, family that has been removed from, particularly from Black people and Indigenous people in our country since the foundation of our country. And so when these people who are rioting and looting are taking something, we're not saying that these people are not saying that that's good or that that's right, but we're sort of saying, like, look at the larger picture of what was taken from them for hundreds of years, not just today. And so, you know, this is one of those questions of sort of both and. Both, two things can be true at the same time. That something is not necessarily good, but it also might be calling us to something bigger or more powerful to pay attention to. So I would say, for me as a white person, that it's not my place to determine how people of color react against systems of violence and oppression in our country. I don't get to decide. It's not up to me. And so I might watch and say, I wish there was a more peaceful way to do this. But these people have tried for so long to get the attention of the powers that be, and it hasn't worked. And I would venture to say that almost any societal change has not come without a fight. Very, very rarely has there been major societal change that has happened calmly and without violence or destruction. The women's right to vote, particularly white women's right to vote, was won not because men decided one day that they should grant women the right to vote, but because women were blocking streets. They were chaining themselves to the White House. They were picketing. They were going on starvation, long periods of starvation. They were being force-fed in order to. So this is not about people just having a lot of logical conversation. Sometimes people have to cause a ruckus to get attention, to make it problematic enough for change to be enacted. The Civil Rights Act was not enacted until a lot of people were beaten and died at Selma. Particularly, a Unitarian white minister was murdered, which got the attention of white America. Countless Black people had been murdered, beaten, lynched, denied their right to vote, and it wasn't enough until a white man died. And then the president signed the Civil Rights Act into law. And so again, I would say that it's just a really hard question that has multiple truths at the same time. And the Black Lives Matter movement is calling for our society to value Black lives the same as white lives. And I haven't heard that they have been calling for destruction or calling for looting, but that I have seen that that there has been some, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement around the looting in Chicago recently, has called it reparations. Reparations is the idea that people, Black people have been denied money, land, access to housing, access to education for so long, for so many generations, that they're like, this is payback. This is some of that payment. And so, is it reparations? No. Should we have reparations? Yes. Both of those things are true. So, and until our country and our society gets its act together and can manage reparations, maybe this is how it's going to happen. So, yeah, I guess I would just, try to have that compassionate stance again when I look at these things and say, why? Why is this happening? If I don't understand why, maybe I need to learn more. And I wish it could happen more calmly and more reasoned, but that tends to not work. So that's going to be how I think this happens. So I think that is, I think that's our time for these questions. So thank you so much for asking the questions. I will go back through and see if I missed any questions, and maybe they'll get answered in a scroll article or in a future sermon. Thank you, everybody.